In the spring of 1946, a woman stood in a New Jersey courtroom and said out loud what no one connected to the American underworld was supposed to say. She named names. She described finances. She told a judge that her husband was not a legitimate businessman, but one of the most dangerous men in New York. The woman was Anna Genovese. The husband was Vito. She did not do this out of courage, exactly. She did it because she had run out of other options. The affairs had continued for years. The money had moved through accounts she could not access. The home in Atlantic Highlands, large, expensive, carefully maintained, had become a place she occupied without belonging to. And so she walked into a courtroom and spoke. What happened next was not justice. It was not liberation. It was something quieter and harder to name, a punishment that arrived without a single act of violence, administered through social pressure, financial exposure, and the slow withdrawal of every protection the Genovese name had once provided. But to understand what that moment cost her and what it meant, it is necessary to go back further. Back to where she began, back to who she was before a man named Vito Genovese decided that she was something he wanted to have, and then to understand a second woman, another Anna, who came after, who watched what had happened to the first and who made her choice anyway. Anna Petillo was born in 1900 in the tightly compressed world of Italian immigrant New York, where the boundaries between neighborhoods, families, and fates were drawn early and moved rarely. Her family had settled in the Lower East Side, in the same dense pocket of tenement blocks and street-level commerce that absorbed hundreds of thousands of Southern Italian immigrants in the decades around the turn of the century. It was a world that ran on proximity. To work, to church, to people who shared your dialect and your suspicions of everyone who did not. Privacy was a luxury, reputation was a currency, and marriage, for a young woman in that community, was not primarily a romantic arrangement. It was an economic and social transaction dressed in the language of feeling. She was young when she first married. Her first husband was a man named Gerard Vernotico, a figure who existed in the historical record mostly as a name attached to a fate. They married in the early 1920s, and by the standards of their community, it was an unremarkable union. Two people from the same compressed world, building what modest life that world allowed. There is no surviving record of what Anna thought of Gerard, whether the marriage was warm or cold, tender or indifferent. What survives is only the outline. They were together, and then circumstances made that impossible, though Anna would not understand the nature of those circumstances until much later, if she ever fully did. Vito Genovese had come from the same general world. Born in 1897 in a small town near Naples, he had arrived in New York as a teenager and moved through the Lower East Side with the particular combination of charm, violence, and patience that would define his entire career. By the early 1920s, he was already embedded in the structures that would eventually become the Genovese crime family, running numbers, collecting debts, moving closer to the inner circle of Lucky Luciano, whose operational intelligence Vito both admired and quietly measured himself against. He was not yet powerful in the way he would become, but he was already dangerous in the way that certain men are dangerous before anyone outside their immediate circle has noticed. He noticed Anna Petillo. The historical record does not explain exactly when or how. What it does record is that by 1924, Vito Genovese and Anna Petillo were married. Gerard Vernotico was, at that point, still alive. What this means, whether Anna left one marriage for another, whether the first marriage had already dissolved, whether Vito's interest in her was something she welcomed or something that arrived in her life with the particular force that Vito applied to most things he wanted, is not something the documents resolve cleanly. What is clear is that she became Anna Genovese, and that the life attached to that name was already, in its earliest form, something other than what it appeared from the outside. The apartment they shared in the mid-1920s was modest by the standards Vito would later set for himself. He was still ascending, still proving himself within a hierarchy that rewarded patience and brutality in roughly equal measure. For Anna, the early years of the marriage would have carried the texture of ordinary working-class immigrant life, crowded, financially uncertain, structured around the rhythms of a community that asked little about where money came from as long as it came. Vito was present in the way that men in that world were present, physically, intermittently, with authority over decisions that Anna would not have been expected to question. What she knew about his work is impossible to measure with certainty. The wives of men in Vito's world operated within a carefully maintained fiction, that the money was legitimate, that the absences were business, that the men who came and went from the apartment were associates in some vaguely defined commercial enterprise. Whether any individual woman believed this fiction entirely, partially, or not at all depended on how much she allowed herself to see. In Anna's case, she was not a naive woman from the countryside. She had grown up in the same neighborhoods, heard the same stories, understood the same codes. The fiction was not something she was deceived into. It was something she was expected to maintain. Through the late 1920s, Vito's position hardened and grew. He became closer to Luciano, deeper in the structures of organized crime in New York. The money improved. The apartment gave way to better addresses, and Anna moved with all of it, occupying the role that the wife of a rising figure was expected to occupy. Present at the right social moments, invisible at the dangerous ones, domestic in a way that suggested stability without ever quite achieving it. There were children. The record is incomplete on this, as it is on so much of Anna's life, but the domestic architecture of the marriage included the ordinary pressures of a household that had to function in two registers simultaneously, as a legitimate family on the surface and as a supporting structure for criminal operations underneath. This required a specific kind of management that fell, as it always did, to the woman in the house. Vito came and went. Anna stayed. By the early 1930s, the marriage had already accumulated the weight of a decade of this arrangement. Vito was more powerful, more distracted, more surrounded by a world that had no real place for a wife in it. He traveled. He maintained relationships with other women. He made decisions, financial, criminal, personal, without consultation, because consultation was not something the structure of his world required of him. Anna existed within the marriage as a fixed point, a domestic constant, while Vito moved freely through a life that grew steadily further from anything she could follow or fully understand. And then, in 1932, something happened that would sit at the center of Anna's life, and of her marriage, for every year that followed, whether she spoke of it or not. Gerard Vernotico, her first husband, was murdered. He was strangled. The killing was later attributed to Vito Genovese, ordered so that Vito could pursue Anna without the inconvenience of a living prior husband. Whether this is precisely accurate, whether Vito had Anna specifically in mind when he ordered it, or whether other factors were involved, is something historians have disputed around the margins. What is not disputed is the result. Gerard Vernotico died violently. Vito married Anna, and the sequence of those events was not a coincidence. What Anna knew about this, and when she knew it, is one of the central silences of her story. She had been married to Gerard. She had then married the man who, by the account that has survived, arranged Gerard's death. Whether she knew this at the time of the marriage, learned it later, or lived in the particular suspended state of knowing without confirming, the state that women in that world were often required to inhabit, is something the historical record does not answer cleanly. What it does record is that she stayed. For over a decade after 1932, Anna Genovese remained in the marriage, maintained the household, bore the name, and kept the particular silence that the name required. She was not invisible. She appears in social records, in the orbit of the community that surrounded Vito's world, in the domestic life of a man who was becoming one of the most powerful organized crime figures in the United States. But she was not, in any meaningful sense, a participant in that power. She was adjacent to it. She was contained by it. The marriage continued into the 1940s, and the distance between Anna and Vito only grew. His affairs were not hidden exactly. They were conducted with the confidence of a man who did not expect to be challenged on personal matters, who had arranged his world so that the people around him absorbed consequences, rather than imposing them. Anna absorbed them. She managed the household, maintained the appearances, and watched a marriage that had never been built on partnership become something closer to an obligation she could not exit without cost. The cost, when she finally moved toward it, would be higher than she could have fully anticipated. Not in violence, but in the specific, grinding exposure that comes from being the woman who named a powerful man in public, in a world that had no framework for what to do with her afterward. By the late 1920s, Vito Genovese had begun to move in a way that made the ordinary geography of a marriage, shared meals, predictable evenings, the slow accumulation of a life built in one place, structurally impossible. He was not simply busy. He was operating inside a world that ran on compartmentalization, where the less any single person knew about the whole, the safer everyone was. This applied to associates, to rivals, and, without exception, to wives. The apartment had improved by then. The address had changed. The furniture was better. These were not incidental details. In the world Vito moved through, the quality of a man's domestic arrangements was legible to other men as a signal of his standing, and Anna's role in maintaining that signal was as real as any other function she served. A well-kept household, a presentable wife, children who appeared in the right contexts. These were not expressions of domestic warmth. They were operational requirements dressed in the clothes of family life. Anna ran that household. There is no detailed record of what her daily life looked like during these years. No diary, no correspondence that has surfaced, no account from someone who knew her well enough to describe the texture of her mornings or the way she managed the hours when Vito was absent, which was most of them. What survives is structural. The address, the finances, the social geography of the community she moved through. And from that structure, a shape emerges of a woman who was expected to hold things together without being told what, exactly, she was holding together or why. The money during this period came in quantities that were difficult to explain through any legitimate channel. Vito maintained a nominal business presence. He ran a numbers operation, had interests in various street-level enterprises. But the income that moved through the household vastly exceeded what those operations could account for on paper. This was not unusual in the world he occupied. Nearly every family in his orbit lived with some version of this arrangement. Money that arrived without a clear origin story, spent on things that signaled prosperity without requiring anyone to explain the math. For Anna, this meant living inside a financial reality she had no formal role in managing. The money was Vito's. The decisions about it were Vito's. She had access to what she needed for the household, food, clothing, the maintenance of the domestic image Vito's position required, but not to the underlying structure of where it came from or where it went. This was not an arrangement specific to Anna. It was the standard architecture of criminal household finance during this period, designed specifically to keep women at a distance from information that could become dangerous if it ever needed to be disclosed. Vito's relationship with Lucky Luciano deepened through the late 1920s and into the early 1930s. Luciano was building something, a restructured, rationalized American organized crime apparatus, and Vito was one of the men he trusted to help build it. This meant travel, meetings conducted in locations well away from the neighborhood, associations with men whose names Anna would have known by reputation, if not by face. It meant that Vito's absences were not random. They followed a logic she was not permitted to know. The affairs began, or became more visible, during this period. Vito was not a man who invested much energy in concealment where his personal life was concerned. He operated from an assumption of impunity that extended from his criminal activities to his domestic ones, and the women he pursued outside the marriage were not kept at a careful distance from his regular life. Some of them moved through the same social world that Anna occupied. Some of them were known by name and by reputation to the people around her. There is a particular kind of humiliation that operates without anyone acknowledging it directly, where the fact of a thing is widely understood, but never spoken aloud, because speaking it would require everyone present to respond to it, and no one in the room has any interest in doing that. Anna lived inside this for years. The affairs were not a secret. They were simply not a subject. And in the community that surrounded Vito's world, this was not unusual. The wife's knowledge of a husband's infidelities was treated as a private burden she was expected to carry without making it anyone else's problem. She had the house in Atlantic Highlands by this point. It was a substantial property, large enough to suggest prosperity, set apart enough from the city to suggest a kind of separation between Vito's public life and his domestic one. Though this separation was largely cosmetic, the house required maintenance. It required a woman who could manage staff, receive guests when Vito's position required hospitality, and present a surface of domestic normalcy to the outside world. Anna did all of this. It was, in a real sense, her work. Unpaid, unacknowledged in the way that labor is unacknowledged when it is performed by a wife, but essential to the functioning of the image Vito needed to maintain. The guests who came to the house were not social calls in any ordinary sense. Men who moved in Vito's world did not make casual visits. When someone came to Atlantic Highlands, it was because something needed to be discussed, decided, or confirmed, and the domestic setting was chosen specifically because it was less visible than a restaurant or a social club. Anna would have known this. She would have managed the household around these visits, prepared the right food, ensured the right level of comfort, stayed present enough to be hospitable, and absent enough to hear nothing that would later require her silence to be enforced rather than assumed. This was its own kind of skill, and she had refined it across years of practice, knowing when to enter a room and when to leave it, knowing which men required a greeting and which ones preferred to arrive and depart without being formally acknowledged, knowing above all that the hospitality she provided was a service to Vito's business as much as to his guests, and that her competence in providing it was one of the things that made her useful to him. Through the early 1930s, as Prohibition moved toward its end and the criminal landscape shifted accordingly, Vito's operations evolved. The reliable income from bootlegging began to dry up, and the men who had built their power on it were forced to redirect into other areas: gambling, labor racketeering, the numbers rackets that had always run alongside the liquor trade, but now needed to absorb more of the financial weight. Vito moved through this transition more smoothly than many of his contemporaries. He was adaptable in a way that had less to do with intelligence than with a fundamental indifference to the particular method of making money. He cared about the money and the power it represented, not the mechanism. None of this translated into any change in Anna's daily life, except that Vito was gone more, to different places, for reasons that were never explained. The household continued. The house in Atlantic Highlands continued. The social performance of a stable, prosperous family continued, and underneath all of it, the marriage continued its slow drift towards something that could no longer be called a partnership, and had perhaps never quite been one. There was a daughter. The historical record is sparse on the details of Anna's children. Their names appear occasionally, their lives remain largely outside the documented record. But the presence of children added another layer to the architecture of Anna's daily existence. She was not only maintaining a household and a public image, she was raising children inside an environment whose real nature she could neither explain nor entirely conceal. The ordinary questions that children ask about fathers, where he is, what he does, why he is not there, had no honest answers available to them. And the answers Anna gave, whatever they were, required her to maintain a fiction, not just for the outside world, but inside her own home. By the mid-1930s, the distance between Anna and Vito had grown from something that could be attributed to the demands of his work into something more structural, more permanent. He came to Atlantic Highlands when he needed to, not when she needed him to. He brought with him the authority of a man whose position in the world had hardened into something nearly institutional. He was not merely a criminal figure, but a recognized power in the landscape of organized crime in New York, a man whose decisions affected hundreds of people and whose capacity for violence was widely understood, even when it was not being displayed. She occupied the house, she managed the staff, she maintained the image, and the years accumulated around her, each one adding another layer to a silence that had been required of her since the beginning. About what she knew, about what she suspected, about what she had come to understand regarding the man she had married, and the specific nature of the world he had built and that she lived inside of, adjacent to everything, included in nothing. Gerard Vernetico was strangled in 1932. He was killed on a street in New York, and the men who did it were connected to Vito Genovese. The historical account that has survived, assembled from court records, FBI files, and the testimony of figures who moved through the same world holds that Vito ordered the killing because he wanted Anna, and Gerard was in the way. The murder was not incidental to the marriage. According to this account, it was a precondition for it. This is the fact that sits at the center of Anna's story, and it is the fact that is most difficult to place correctly, not because it is uncertain in its outline, but because its meaning depends entirely on what Anna knew, when she knew it, and what knowing it required of her in the years that followed. And on all of those questions, the record is nearly silent. What is known is the sequence. Anna had been married to Gerard Vernotico. Gerard was killed. Anna subsequently became, or remained, involved with Vito Genovese, and the two were married. The timeline is compressed enough that the relationship between these events is not incidental. Vito did not wait a respectful interval. The world he operated in did not require him to. Gerard Vernotico himself is a figure who barely registers in the historical record beyond his death. He appears as a name, a victim, a man whose primary documented significance is that he was married to a woman Vito Genovese wanted. What he was like, what his marriage to Anna had been, whether it was a relationship she valued or one she had already moved away from emotionally before its violent end. None of this has survived in any form that allows for real assessment. He is present in the story only as an absence, which is perhaps the most precise description of what Vito's action made him. The question of what Anna knew is not simple, and it deserves more careful attention than it typically receives in accounts that treat her primarily as a background figure in Vito's story. She had grown up in the same world he operated in. She understood, at a structural level, how men in that world resolved inconveniences. She knew that Vito was not a man who accepted obstacles to things he wanted. She had watched, across the years of their relationship, how he moved through the world, with a patience that was always underlaid by a capacity for decisive, irreversible action when patience ran out. Whether she knew specifically that Vito had ordered Gerard's death is something the record does not confirm. But the more relevant question may not be whether she knew in the precise, documented, legally actionable sense of the word. It may be whether she understood. In the way that people who live close to violence develop an understanding that does not require explicit confirmation. What had happened and why? If she understood, then every year of the marriage that followed was built on that understanding. Every domestic routine, every managed silence, every guest received, and every conversation steered away from dangerous territory. All of it took place in the shadow of a thing she could not speak about, could not confront, could not even acknowledge to herself too directly without risking the collapse of the entire structure she lived inside. This is a specific kind of psychological weight. It is not guilt in the ordinary sense, because Anna did not order the killing and may have had no advanced knowledge of it. But it is not innocence either, because innocence requires a certain kind of not knowing that is very difficult to sustain when you are living inside the household of the man who arranged the thing you are not supposed to know about. What she carried was something in between, a knowledge that had to be perpetually managed, kept at a distance, never examined directly, because examination would require a response she had no power to make. The social world Anna moved through in the 1930s would not have offered her a framework for processing this, even if she had wanted one. The community that surrounded Vito's operation was not one where women discussed what they suspected about their husband's activities. The priests who served that community were not equipped, and in many cases were not inclined, to engage with confessions that touched on organized violence. The other women in Anna's social orbit were themselves wives of men whose activities required similar silences. The collective management of what everyone understood but no one said was not a personal failing in this world. It was a social norm enforced by the same mechanisms that enforced every other norm in that community. The understanding that deviation had consequences and that the consequences fell on the person who deviated. So Anna carried it. She carried it through the mid-1930s as Vito's power consolidated and the household in Atlantic Highlands became more established, more visible, more clearly the domestic face of a criminal enterprise that was growing into something nearly institutional. She carried it through the affairs, which continued and which required their own management, their own silences, their own daily negotiations between what she knew and what she was prepared to act on. She carried it through the years when Vito was present in the house, but absent from the marriage in every way that might have given the marriage some redemptive content. In 1934, Vito was charged with murder. The victim was a man named Boccia, a figure from his own world who had created a problem that Vito resolved in the way he resolved problems. The charge was serious. For a period, it looked as though Vito might face genuine legal consequence for the first time in his career. And then, in the way that such things were managed in his world, the witnesses disappeared. One of them died, another recanted. The case collapsed. Anna would have lived through this period, the charge, the legal proceedings, the disappearance of witnesses from inside the household. She would have known that a man was dead. She would have known that her husband was charged with his death. She would have watched, from her particular vantage point, as the machinery that protected men like Vito from the consequences of what they did operate in real time. And then she would have watched Vito walk free. What this did to whatever remained of her internal moral accounting is impossible to know with precision. But it is worth noting that this was not an isolated event. It was a pattern, and by 1934, Anna had been inside the pattern long enough to recognize it as such. Vito did things. Men died or disappeared. The legal system reached toward him and was deflected. Life in Atlantic Highlands continued. The household ran. The image held. 2 years later, in 1936, Vito left the country entirely. A new murder charge, again connected to Boccia, as investigators continued to build the case despite the earlier setbacks, had become serious enough that remaining in New York was no longer viable. He fled to Italy, arriving during the ascendancy of Mussolini's regime, and proceeded to ingratiate himself with the fascist government in ways that would later require considerable historical documentation to fully map. He took money with him. He took his freedom. He did not take Anna. She was left in Atlantic Highlands with the house, the household, the staff, and a husband who was now not merely absent in the ordinary way of criminal enterprise, but physically on another continent, beyond reach, beyond any expectation of return that she could hold on to with any confidence. She had access to money. Vito had not left her destitute. But the money came through channels she did not control, dependent on the continued functioning of an organization whose leadership and priorities could shift without her knowledge. The years between 1936 and Vito's return, yet he would not come back to the United States until 1945 after the war had ended and the murder charge had been maneuvered into collapse, represent a period in Anna's life for which the historical record is particularly thin. She remained in the house. She managed. She waited in the specific, unacknowledged way that women in her position were expected to wait, without complaint, without public acknowledgement of the abandonment, without doing anything that would disturb the surface of a marriage that existed during these years primarily as a legal and financial arrangement, rather than any kind of lived reality. What she thought about during those years, whether she thought about Gerard Vernotico, whether she allowed herself to trace the line from his death to her life in that house, whether the silence she had been required to maintain had by then calcified into something she no longer experienced as silence, but simply as the texture of her existence, is something no document records and no witness describes. She was alone in a house that belonged in every meaningful sense to a man who was not there. And the thing she could not speak about had been sitting inside the walls of that house for over a decade, accumulating the particular weight that unacknowledged things accumulate when there is no mechanism for releasing them and no permission to try. Vito Genovese returned to the United States in 1945 under circumstances that were, even by the standards of his career, remarkable. He had spent nearly a decade in Italy, had cultivated relationships with the Mussolini regime, had allegedly assisted Italian authorities in ways that served his own interests, and had then, as the war turned and American forces moved through Italy, pivoted with characteristic smoothness to assist the Allied military as an interpreter and logistics facilitator. The murder charge that had driven him out of New York had not disappeared, but the witnesses who could sustain it had. He came back to a country that had changed around him, to a criminal landscape that had shifted in his absence, and to a marriage that had been running on institutional momentum for nearly a decade, without either participant. Anna was still in Atlantic Highlands. She had maintained the house, managed the finances available to her, and lived through the war years in the specific suspended state that Vito's absence imposed. Not a widow, not a wife in any functional sense, but something in between that had no clean name and no social script. When Vito returned, he did not return to the marriage. He returned to New York, to the business of reasserting his position in an organized crime hierarchy that had reorganized considerably while he was gone, and to the personal life he had always conducted, as though a wife in New Jersey was an administrative detail rather than a person with a claim on his attention. The affairs had not stopped during his time in Italy. There were women there, as there had been women in New York. By the time he returned to the United States, he had already developed a serious involvement with a woman named Anna Vernotico, a widow from his world, with children, whom he intended to pursue openly. This was not conducted with any particular discretion. The people around Vito knew. The community that Anna Genovese moved through knew, and Anna Genovese herself, who had spent years managing the knowledge of his infidelities through the practiced maintenance of not quite knowing, found herself confronted with something that had moved beyond the range of that strategy. She had absorbed a great deal over 20 years. She had absorbed the affairs, the absences, the money she did not control, the household she managed for a man who treated it as a convenience. She had absorbed the knowledge, however precisely it was held, of what had happened to Gerard Vernotico and what that meant about the man she had married and the terms on which the marriage had been built. She had absorbed a decade of effective abandonment, maintaining a domestic structure that served Vito's image and interests while he was on another continent, conducting a life that had nothing to do with her. But there is a point at which absorption becomes impossible. Not because a person suddenly develops a new capacity for outrage, but because the thing being absorbed has grown too large for the container, and the container finally fails. For Anna, that point appears to have arrived sometime in the mid-1940s, as it became clear that Vito's return had not included any recalibration of the marriage, any acknowledgement of what she had managed in his absence, or any reduction in the behavior that had defined the marriage from its earliest years. She consulted a lawyer. This was, in the world she moved through, an act that carried weight well beyond its legal dimensions. A wife of a man in Vito's position did not file for divorce. The reasons were not primarily legal. Divorce was possible, technically, for anyone. The reasons were structural. A divorce proceeding required disclosure. It required the examination of finances. It required a woman who had lived inside a criminal household to stand before a court and account for the nature of that household, which meant either lying to the court or telling it things that the men her husband was connected to had very strong interests in keeping undisclosed. The expectation, unspoken but absolute, was that wives in Anna's position took what they were given and did not take legal action that could expose the underlying structure. The women who had done so before her had not fared well. The social pressure alone was considerable. The community that surrounded organized crime in New York was small enough and interconnected enough that a woman who broke the implicit rules of her position would find every door in that world closing quietly against her, without any single person needing to make a decision or issue a threat. Anna filed anyway. In 1946, she initiated divorce proceedings against Vito Genovese in a New Jersey court, and in doing so she made a series of disclosures that were, by the standards of her world, extraordinary. She told the court that Vito's income came from criminal enterprise. She named specific operations. She described the finances of the household in enough detail to make clear that the money had not come from legitimate business. She put into a legal record, in plain language, what everyone in her community had always known, and no one had ever said publicly. The immediate legal outcome of this was a divorce settlement. The court awarded Anna a support arrangement. The specific terms were contested and would remain contested for years, and the marriage was formally dissolved. On paper, it was a legal proceeding that reached a legal conclusion. Anna had asked for a divorce and received one. What happened around that legal conclusion was different in character and far more consequential for how her remaining years would unfold. The disclosures she had made in court became public record. Newspapers covered the proceedings. The details she had provided about Vito's operations were now accessible to anyone who chose to read them. including federal investigators who had been building cases against organized crime figures for years, and who found in Anna's testimony a degree of specificity that was difficult to obtain through other channels. She had not intended to become an informant. She had not coordinated with law enforcement. She had gone to court to end a marriage, and in doing so, she had placed information into a public record that served purposes well beyond her own. Vito did not respond with violence. This is a fact that some accounts present as evidence of restraint, but it is more accurately understood as evidence of calculation. A direct act of violence against a woman who had just testified in open court would have created exactly the kind of attention that served no one's interests, including Vito's. The punishment that arrived instead was administrative, the systematic removal of every financial protection the marriage had provided. The support arrangement became a site of ongoing conflict. Vito contested it, delayed it, structured his finances to make enforcement difficult. The money that Anna had been promised moved through mechanisms she could not easily access or verify, managed by an organization whose accounting was deliberately opaque and whose cooperation with any legal order it found inconvenient was purely theoretical. She had won the legal proceeding, but the legal proceeding existed in a world where the other party's compliance with its outcomes was voluntary, and Vito had never been a man who felt bound by obligations he had not chosen. She moved out of Atlantic Highlands, the house, the property she had maintained for years, the domestic anchor of a marriage she had managed almost entirely alone, passed out of her life. What replaced it was a reduced set of circumstances that required constant legal effort to sustain, fighting through lawyers and courts for money that Vito's organization was structurally designed to make difficult to reach. The community around her had largely withdrawn. The women who had been her social world were wives of men connected to the same organization, and whatever personal warmth they might have felt for Anna was outweighed by the institutional reality that she had made disclosures in a courtroom, and that proximity to her now carried a specific kind of risk. She had not been threatened. She did not need to be. The social architecture of the world she had lived in for 20 years simply rearranged itself around her absence, and she found herself outside it. Her health declined through the late 1940s. The specific nature of what she experienced is not well documented, but the combination of financial stress, social isolation, the ongoing legal battle over the support arrangement, and the accumulated weight of everything that had preceded it produced a visible deterioration in her circumstances. She was not destitute, but she was no longer protected, and the difference between those two conditions in the world she had inhabited was the difference between a life with some structure and a life that had to be rebuilt from almost nothing in middle age without the community or resources that might have made the rebuilding possible. She died in 1963. She was in her early 60s. The cause of death is not prominently recorded in the sources that have documented her life, which is itself a form of information. She died without the death being notable enough to require explanation, which is to say she died as a private person, without the social significance that her years inside the Genovese world might have been expected to confer, and which had in fact been stripped from her by the act of leaving it. The divorce proceedings, the testimony, the legal battle over support. These are the moments in Anna's life that the historical record treats as her story. But the more precise account is that these were the moments when she finally attempted to act on her own behalf, and that the world she had spent 20 years serving responded by ensuring that acting on her own behalf was as costly as possible, for as long as possible, until there was nothing left to take. Anna Vernatico was a widow when Vito Genovese began pursuing her in the mid-1940s. Her husband, Stephen Vernatico, had died, leaving her with 2 children and the particular social position of a woman from the Italian-American community in New York who was neither fully unattached nor fully provided for, a position that carried its own pressures and its own limited range of available responses. She was not destitute. She was not without connections. But she was alone in a world that did not have a comfortable place for a woman in her circumstances, and Vito Genovese was a man who understood how to make himself appear to be a solution to exactly that kind of problem. The courtship, such as it was, unfolded during the same period that Vito's divorce proceedings with the first Anna were grinding through the New Jersey courts. This overlap was not incidental. Vito had already determined that the first marriage was over in any meaningful sense, and he moved toward the second with the same forward momentum that characterized everything he did, without waiting for one situation to fully resolve before beginning the next, without apparent concern for the way the simultaneity of these two things might appear to anyone watching, because the appearance of things to people watching had never been a primary constraint on his behavior. What the second Anna knew about the first is difficult to establish with precision. She moved through the same general world. The Italian-American community in New York was not large enough, and the network of people connected to Vito's operation was not diffuse enough for the story of the divorce proceedings to be unknown to someone in her social position. The first Anna's disclosures in court had been covered by newspapers. The financial dispute was not a private matter, and Vito himself was not a figure whose life required much investigative effort to learn about. He was visible, known, discussed. The woman who became his second wife did not arrive at the marriage without context. She was, by the accounts that survive, a practical woman. This is not a criticism. Practicality, in the world she inhabited, was a survival skill, and a woman with 2 children and limited independent resources, who declined every available arrangement on principle, was not being principled. She was being impractical in a way that would fall on her children as much as on herself. The social infrastructure of the Italian-American community in New York in the 1940s offered women in her position a narrow range of options, and Vito Genovese, powerful, financially secure, willing to provide, was not an option that required explanation or defense within that infrastructure. He was, by the visible standards of her world, a catch. Whether she found him personally appealing is something the record does not address. What the record does address, obliquely, is the structure of what he was offering: stability, money, the social protection that came from being attached to one of the most powerful men in the American underworld. These were not trivial things. They were the things that her world measured a woman's security by, and Vito could provide all of them. They married in 1952. The first Anna had been dead to Vito's world for years by then, present in the ongoing legal dispute over support payments, which continued to require his financial and legal attention, but absent from the social geography of his life in every other sense. The second Anna stepped into a role that had been vacated but not restructured. The same household, the same social obligations, the same position adjacent to power without access to it, the same requirement to maintain appearances without being informed of the realities those appearances were designed to conceal. The house they occupied together was in Atlantic Highlands, the same general geography that had defined the first marriage, though the specific property had changed. Vito had maintained and expanded his real estate holdings through the years of legal exposure and his time in Italy, and by the early 1950s, the household he could offer was considerably more elaborate than the one he had established in the 1920s. The domestic setting reflected his position: large, well-maintained, staffed, located at a sufficient remove from the city to suggest a kind of private life while remaining accessible to the organizational needs that required his presence in New York regularly. For the second Anna, stepping into this household meant stepping into a role that had been worn in by someone else. The staff already knew what was expected. The social rituals were already established. The geography of the marriage, what spaces she would occupy, what information she would have access to, what she would be required to manage, and what she would be required not to notice, was already mapped. She did not design this arrangement. She inherited it. Her children came with her. This is a detail that matters more than it might initially appear. Vito was not, by any surviving account, a man who had a deep investment in the domestic lives of children, including his own. He had maintained a formal acknowledgement of his children from the first marriage without anything that resembled sustained paternal involvement. The second Anna's children were absorbed into the household as part of the package of the marriage, but the household was organized around Vito's needs and Vito's schedule, and the presence of children in it did not alter that fundamental orientation. What this meant practically was that the second Anna was managing a household with children, while also managing the obligations of being Vito Genovese's wife, the social calendar that his position required, the hospitality that his associates expected, the maintenance of a domestic image that had to be calibrated to the specific demands of a man whose public profile was simultaneously that of a successful businessman and an open secret in the world of organized crime. These were not compatible requirements, and navigating between them required a constant, invisible labor that the people around her would have understood as simply the way things were. Vito's power was at or near its peak in the early 1950s. The American underworld had reorganized considerably since his return from Italy, and he had spent the years between 1945 and 1952 reasserting himself within a hierarchy that had restructured in his absence. By the time of the second marriage, he was positioned as one of the dominant figures in the New York organized crime landscape, a man whose decisions shaped the operations of hundreds of people and whose capacity for violence, though rarely displayed personally at this stage of his career, remained the underlying guarantee of everything he said and agreed to. The second Anna entered this world at the moment of its greatest visible prosperity, which was also the moment when the forces that would eventually dismantle it were already in motion. The FBI had been building cases against organized crime figures throughout the late 1940s. Federal investigators had accumulated enough from various sources, including notably the testimony of the first Anna in the divorce proceedings, to have a detailed picture of how Vito's organization operated. The prosperity of the early 1950s was real, but it was prospering against a background of increasing federal scrutiny that Vito was aware of, and that shaped, in ways the second Anna would not have been told about, the decisions he was making. She would have known that there was scrutiny. It was impossible to be inside the world she had entered and not know that federal attention was a constant environmental feature. But knowing that scrutiny exists and understanding its specific nature and trajectory are different things, and Vito was not a man who briefed his wife on the operational details of managing law enforcement attention. She knew what she could not avoid knowing and was expected to maintain ignorance of everything else. The early years of the marriage appear from the outside as a period of surface stability. Vito was present more than he had been in the years immediately following his return, occupied with the work of consolidating his position rather than the constant travel and disruption of the reassertion period. The household in Atlantic Highlands functioned. The children were there. The social obligations were met. From a distance, it had the shape of a normal life for a woman in her community, prosperous, ordered, built around a husband whose prominence conferred status and whose presence conferred a certain kind of security. What it felt like from the inside is something the second Anna never described publicly. She was not a woman who gave interviews, wrote memoirs, or left a documented interior life. She moved through the world she had entered with a discretion that the world required, and that she appears to have internalized completely. What she thought about the marriage, about Vito, about the first Anna whose shadow lay over the household she now ran. These are questions the record does not answer because she never answered them, and no one who knew her well enough to ask has left an account. What the record does preserve is the structure. A woman in her 40s with 2 children, married to one of the most powerful and dangerous men in the United States, running a household that served as the domestic face of a criminal organization, with no formal role in the decisions that shaped her life and no apparent mechanism for influencing them. The stability of those early years was real in the sense that visible disruption was absent. It was not real in any deeper sense because the ground it rested on had never been stable, and the forces that would prove this were already at work in ways that neither she nor anyone in the household could see clearly enough to prepare for. By the mid-1950s, Vito Genovese had achieved something that very few men in his world managed to sustain for long. He was simultaneously at the height of his organizational power and maintaining, at least on the surface, a domestic life that projected the image of a man with legitimate standing in his community. The house in Atlantic Highlands received guests. The second Anna appeared at the right social functions. The marriage, from the outside, had the appearance of a settled, prosperous arrangement between 2 people who had found their place in the world. The appearance was doing a great deal of work. Vito's organizational activities during this period were expanding in ways that required increasing amounts of his attention and generated increasing amounts of federal scrutiny. He was involved in narcotics trafficking at a scale that went well beyond the street-level operations that had always been a feature of the criminal landscape. This was wholesale, international, structured movement of heroin into the United States through networks that connected New York to sources in Europe and beyond. The money was substantial. The exposure was considerable. And the decision to move deeply into narcotics was one that other figures in his world had serious reservations about, because the federal penalties for narcotics trafficking were of a different order than those for the gambling and labor racketeering operations that had been the traditional financial foundation of organized crime in New York. None of this was discussed in Atlantic Highlands. The second Anna managed the household, received the guests who came, and maintained the surface of a marriage that was, at its operational core, a support structure for a man whose actual life was conducted almost entirely elsewhere. Vito came home. He ate. He slept. He left. The rhythm of his presence in the household was not the rhythm of a man who lived there in any meaningful sense. It was the rhythm of a man who used the house as a base of operations and who treated the domestic arrangements Anna maintained as a convenience that he expected to function smoothly and that he had no particular interest in examining. The guests who came to the house during this period require some attention. They were not social visitors in any ordinary sense. The men who appeared at the Atlantic Highlands property were figures from Vito's organizational world, men whose names appeared in FBI surveillance reports, whose movements were tracked by federal investigators, whose presence at any gathering was itself an event of organizational significance. When these men came to the house, they came because something needed to happen that was better managed in a domestic setting than in any of the more visible venues Vito used for organizational business. The second Anna navigated these visits with the practiced invisibility that the role required. She was present enough to provide the hospitality that the occasion demanded, food, comfort, the signal that the host's household was in order, and absent enough to ensure that the conversations that took place had no witness whose account could later be required. This was not a performance she had been explicitly trained in. It was a skill she had absorbed from the environment she had entered, refined through repetition, and made so much a part of her daily functioning that it had ceased to feel like a performance at all. It was simply how the household worked. What she overheard in the course of managing a house where these conversations took place is something the record does not address. It is reasonable to assume that she heard things. Fragments of conversation, names mentioned in passing, the general texture of discussions whose specific content she was expected not to retain. The architecture of willful not knowing that she had inherited from the first marriage's household arrangements required not just physical absence from the room where things were said, but a cognitive management of what arrived unavoidably, a trained capacity to receive without processing, to hear without recording. The social calendar that Vito's position required of the second Anna extended beyond the Atlantic Highlands house. There were events in New York, dinners, gatherings in the Italian-American community that served the dual function of social connection and organizational maintenance. Occasions where the wife of a prominent figure was expected to appear and to appear correctly. Correctly meant dressed appropriately, conducting herself with the combination of warmth and discretion that the community expected from women in her position, projecting the image of a stable domestic life without saying anything of substance about the actual content of that life. She was good at this. The accounts that survive from people who encountered the second Anna in these social settings describe a woman who was composed, pleasant, and fundamentally opaque, present in the room without being accessible, performing the social role without revealing anything of the person performing it. Whether this opacity was a conscious strategy or the result of years of navigating an environment where revealing anything could be costly is impossible to determine from the outside. What is clear is that it served the function the marriage required of her. The distance between the public image of the marriage and its private reality had specific dimensions that became clearer as the 1950s progressed. Vito's affairs had not ceased with the second marriage. He moved through his social world with the same assumption of impunity that had characterized his personal life throughout his career. And the second Anna occupied a position in that personal life that was formal rather than intimate. The wife, with all the social and legal weight that the title carried, but not a person whose feelings about his behavior constituted a constraint on it. Whether she expected otherwise is a question the record cannot answer. She had come to the marriage with enough knowledge of Vito's world to have had realistic expectations about what it would require of her. The first marriage's very public collapse, the divorce proceedings, the disclosures in court. All of this was known to her before she married him. She had walked into the arrangement with her eyes open in the sense that the information was available, even if the full weight of what living inside the arrangement would demand could not be fully understood in advance. By the mid-1950s, the financial arrangements of the marriage had also taken on a character that the second Anna had limited ability to influence or fully understand. Vito's wealth moved through structures that were deliberately opaque. Real estate holdings, business interests, cash flows from organizational operations that were managed at several removes from anything that appeared in a legal record. She had access to the household finances in the sense that the house was maintained, the bills were paid, the staff was compensated. She did not have access to the underlying structure, the full picture of where the money came from, where it was held, how it was distributed, or what would happen to it if Vito's legal situation changed. This financial opacity was not an accident. It was the standard architecture of how men in Vito's position managed their households, keeping wives at a functional distance from the financial reality of the organization, both to limit legal exposure and to maintain the structural dependency that kept domestic arrangements stable. A wife who understood the full financial picture was a wife who might, under certain pressures, become a problem. The solution was to ensure she never had the full picture in the first place. The second Anna managed within these constraints, with considerable competence. The household ran, the children grew, the social obligations were met, and underneath all of it, the marriage continued its operation as a formal arrangement between two people who occupied the same house without sharing the same world. Vito moving through an organizational life of expanding scale and increasing risk. The second Anna maintaining the domestic structure that provided him with the image of normalcy that his position required. In 1956, a series of federal surveillance operations began to close around the edges of Vito's world with a specificity that suggested the investigators had sources inside the organization or very close to it. Meetings that had previously taken place with a degree of confidence were now conducted with greater care. The men who came to the house in Atlantic Highlands came less frequently, and when they came, the conversations were shorter and the departures faster. The social texture of the household shifted in a way that the second Anna would have registered without necessarily being able to name. A tightening, a guardedness, a reduction in the casual confidence that had characterized Vito's domestic presence in earlier years. She managed this shift the same way she managed everything else, by absorbing it into the household routine, without comment, without question, without any external signal that she had noticed the change. Her job was to maintain the surface regardless of what was happening underneath it, and she maintained it. The dinners continued, the hospitality continued. The image of a stable, prosperous household continued to project itself to the outside world as though nothing had shifted at all. But things had shifted. The federal investigation that would eventually produce the Appalachian meeting. The catastrophic 1957 gathering of organized crime figures from across the country that would effectively end the era of confident, open organizational activity that had defined Vito's world since the end of Prohibition, was already building in 1956. The world that the second Anna had married into, the world that had seemed at the time of the marriage to be at the height of its stability and prosperity, was moving toward a collision with consequences that neither she nor Vito had fully calculated. She was in the house when the news from Appalachian arrived. What she said, what she did, how she processed the beginning of the end of the world she had structured her life around. There is no record of any of it. She was, as she had always been, invisible at the moments that mattered most. On the 14th of November 1957, approximately 100 organized crime figures from across the United States converged on a property in Appalachian, New York, owned by a man named Joseph Barbara. The meeting had been called in part because of Vito Genovese, because he had recently orchestrated the murder of Albert Anastasia, one of the most feared figures in the American underworld, and because he wanted the assembled leadership of organized crime in the United States to formally recognize the consequences of that act and his elevated position within the resulting reorganization. He wanted, in a word, acknowledgement. He had arranged a gathering of nearly every significant figure in the American underworld to receive it. What he received instead was a raid. A state trooper named Edgar Croswell had been monitoring the Barber property for reasons unrelated to the larger meeting, and when the volume of expensive cars arriving from out of state exceeded anything that a legitimate gathering could plausibly explain, he called for backup. The law enforcement response that followed was improvised rather than planned. A roadblock, a scramble, men in expensive suits running through the woods and across fields in an attempt to escape a situation that had no dignified exit. 60 or more of the attendees were detained and questioned. The names that emerged from that questioning constituted something close to a complete organizational chart of American organized crime at its mid-century peak. Vito was among those detained. He had not run, whether because he calculated that running would look worse than staying, or because he believed his lawyers could manage whatever followed, or simply because a man of his position and age did not run through fields in November. And he was questioned and released. No immediate charges followed from Appalachian itself, but the meeting's exposure produced consequences that unfolded over the months and years that followed, with the slow accumulating weight of a structural collapse. The most immediate consequence was visibility. Before Appalachian, the existence of a coordinated national organized crime structure was something that law enforcement knew, that journalists occasionally reported on, and that the general public had a vague awareness of without it having been definitively established in the public record. After Appalachian, it was undeniable. The men who had been detained represented too many states, too many organizations, too many connections for the gathering to be explained as anything other than what it was. The Senate investigations that followed. The Kefauver hearings had already laid groundwork, but Appalachian accelerated everything, brought organized crime into living rooms across the country in a way that had no precedent. For Vito, this visibility was a problem of a specific kind. He had spent his career managing the tension between the power that came from being a recognized figure in his world and the safety that came from being invisible to the world outside it. Appalachian collapsed that tension entirely. He was now publicly, documentably, incontrovertibly connected to an organizational structure whose illegal nature had been established before a national audience. The lawyers who had managed his legal exposures throughout his career were working with a fundamentally different set of circumstances than anything they had previously faced. In Atlantic Highlands, the second Anna felt the aftermath of Appalachian not as a single event, but as a gradual environmental change, a shift in the atmosphere of the household that arrived not all at once, but in increments, each one small enough to be absorbed without confrontation, and all of them together amounting to something that could no longer be managed through the strategies that had served until now. The men stopped coming to the house. This happened gradually, then completely. The social gatherings that had been a regular feature of the household, the dinners and visits that had structured the second Anna's domestic obligations and given the marriage its operational rhythm, simply ceased. The house in Atlantic Highlands, which had functioned as an informal organizational venue for years, became something closer to what it appeared on paper, a private residence occupied by a family with no particular significance beyond its address. This withdrawal was not comfortable. The social infrastructure that had surrounded the second Anna during the marriage, the network of wives and families connected to Vito's world, the Italian-American community in which she had her social relationships, the organizational adjacency that had given her domestic life its particular character, began to pull back in the same way it had pulled back from the first Anna after the divorce proceedings. Not through any explicit rejection, but through the gradual reduction of contact that communicated, without words, that proximity to Vito Genovese in the aftermath of Appalachian was a liability rather than an asset. Vito's behavior inside the household changed after Appalachian in ways that reflected the pressure of his situation. He was not a man who displayed anxiety in conventional ways. Fear was not something he had historically allowed to show, and his capacity for projecting confidence was a professional skill as much as a personal quality. But the confidence that had characterized his domestic presence in the earlier years of the marriage was replaced gradually by something more compressed and less available. He was present in the house, but he was present in the way of a man managing a large number of simultaneous problems, none of which he was going to discuss with his wife, and all of which were taking up the cognitive and emotional space that might, in a different kind of marriage, have been available for something else. The second Anna managed around this the way she managed around everything. She did not press. She did not ask questions that would require answers she was not supposed to have. She maintained the household and the domestic surface with the same competence she had always brought to it, and she extended to Vito's altered presence in the house the same accommodation she had always extended to the demands his organizational life placed on the marriage. This was not submission, exactly. It was the application of a skill set she had developed across years of navigating a household whose requirements were determined by factors she did not control and was not consulted about. What the second Anna could not have fully understood in the months after Appalachian was how completely the situation had changed beneath the surface she was maintaining. Federal investigators, energized by the visibility Appalachian had produced, were pursuing multiple lines of inquiry simultaneously. The narcotics operation that Vito had built, the wholesale heroin trafficking that had become a major financial engine of his organization, was the subject of a dedicated investigation that had been building for years and that had, by late 1957, accumulated enough that an indictment was becoming a matter of timing rather than evidence. In 1958, the federal narcotics investigation reached a stage that made Vito's arrest effectively inevitable. The case had been constructed with enough witnesses and enough documentation that the legal strategies that had protected him throughout his career, the witness management, the procedural maneuvering, the financial pressure on prosecutors and judges, were not going to be sufficient. He was indicted on narcotics conspiracy charges in 1958, and the indictment was substantive in a way that his previous legal exposures had not been. For the second Anna, the indictment arrived as the formal confirmation of something she had already been living with since Appalachian, the knowledge that the organizational world that had provided the structure of her marriage was in the process of collapse. The indictment was not a surprise in the sense that surprises are things you have no preparation for. It was the arrival of something she had been watching approach, unable to stop or redirect, managing around as best she could while it got closer. Vito's behavior during the period between the indictment and the trial, a span of roughly a year, had a quality of controlled fatalism about it. He maintained his organizational activities as much as the increased scrutiny allowed. He continued to appear in Atlantic Highlands when his schedule permitted. He did not, by any surviving account, discuss the legal situation with the second Anna in any depth, or prepare her for the practical consequences of a conviction, or arrange the financial affairs of the household in a way that would provide her with a clear and accessible picture of what she would have to manage if he went to prison. This last point is not incidental. The financial opacity that had characterized the marriage from its beginning, the deliberate distance between Anna and the full picture of Vito's holdings, income, and organizational finances, now transformed from an operational feature of the marriage into a direct practical problem. If Vito was convicted and imprisoned, the second Anna would be left to manage a household whose financial foundations she did not fully understand, connected to an organizational structure that was under federal pressure and whose capacity to maintain domestic arrangements for the wife of its imprisoned leader was uncertain at best. She had her children. She had the house. She had whatever access to finances the household's day-to-day operation required. Beyond that, the picture was unclear, and Vito did not clarify it. The trial began in 1959. The second Anna did not testify. She had not been subpoenaed, had not been identified as a relevant witness, and had, by design and by the long practice of her domestic invisibility, nothing in the legal record that connected her directly to the organizational activities that were the subject of the prosecution. She had been kept far enough from the operational reality of the marriage that she could not, even if she had wanted to, have provided the kind of specific, documented testimony that had made the first Anna's divorce proceedings so damaging. This was not an accident. It was the intended outcome of the financial and informational architecture of the marriage, the same architecture that left her without a clear picture of the assets, the same architecture that had structured every domestic arrangement since the beginning. She had been protected from legal exposure by being kept in ignorance. And the ignorance that protected her now also ensured that she faced whatever came next without the information that might have allowed her to prepare for it. Vito was convicted in April 1959. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He was 61 years old. He would never live outside a federal institution again. The second Anna drove back to Atlantic Highlands after the sentencing. The house was still there. The staff, reduced from earlier years but still present, continued the routines of the household. The children were older now, less dependent on the daily management that had structured the earlier years of the marriage. And the world that had provided the context for everything she had done since 1952, the organizational structure, the social network, the domestic rhythms of a household adjacent to power, had, with the closing of a courtroom door, ceased to exist in any form she could rely on. The federal penitentiary at Milan, Michigan received Vito Genovese in the spring of 1959. He arrived as a man who had spent 40 years building an organizational structure that rested at every level on his personal authority, his capacity for violence, his strategic intelligence, his ability to make decisions that other men accepted, because the alternative to accepting them was worse than the decision itself. Prison did not immediately dissolve that authority. The organizational world he had built continued to function, managed through intermediaries, communicated through the carefully monitored channels that the federal system allowed, and through others it did not. He remained, in the language of his world, the boss, a title that prison had complicated, but not yet revoked. In Atlantic Highlands, the second Anna began the process of understanding what the conviction meant in practical terms. This process was more difficult than it should have been, and the difficulty was a direct consequence of the financial architecture she had lived inside for 7 years without ever being permitted to see its full dimensions. The household had been running on money that arrived through channels she had not been required to understand, managed by people she had not been required to know. Now those channels were disrupted by the conviction, by the federal attention that followed it, by the organizational instability that Vito's imprisonment had introduced into the structure that had been generating the money in the first place. She was not immediately impoverished. The real estate holdings that Vito had accumulated over decades, properties in New Jersey, interests in various commercial arrangements, continued to exist as assets, though their accessibility and their actual value, once the legal claims against them were factored in, were not straightforward. Federal investigators had been building asset cases alongside the criminal prosecution, and the process of determining what Vito owned, what could be seized, and what could be passed to family members was a legal proceeding that would take years to resolve and that consumed resources in its resolution. What the second Anna had, concretely, was the house. She had the children, who were older now and beginning to establish their own independent trajectories. She had the staff, reduced further from the post-Appalachian contraction that had already trimmed the household's operational scale. And she had the name, Genovese, which in 1959 carried a specific and complicated weight in the world outside Atlantic Highlands, a weight that had shifted from the social currency it had once represented into something considerably more burdensome. The name had appeared in newspapers throughout the trial. It had appeared in the Senate investigations that followed Appalachian, in the FBI reports that journalists drew on for their coverage, in the public record that the Kefauver hearings and their successors had been building for the better part of a decade. By 1959, Genovese was not a name that a woman in New Jersey could carry through her daily life without it arriving ahead of her, into shops, into social interactions, into the school environments where her children moved. The social protection that the name had once conferred had inverted itself entirely. It was now a target, a marker of a specific kind of association that the outside world had formed a clear and unfavorable view of. She managed the children through this. The historical record is sparse on the specific texture of these years. How she explained Vito's imprisonment to them, how she navigated the school environments and social worlds where her children had to carry the family name, how she maintained some version of normal domestic life in a house that had been stripped of the organizational context that had given it its particular character. What survives is the outline. She stayed in Atlantic Highlands, she maintained the household, and she did what women in her position had always done. which was to absorb the consequences of decisions made entirely without her input and continue functioning. Vito managed his organizational communications from Milan with considerable ingenuity and considerable difficulty. The federal system monitored correspondence, which meant that direct organizational instructions could not be transmitted through official channels. Visitors were permitted but observed. The organizational life that he had conducted with such confidence from Atlantic Highlands, the meetings, the decisions, the constant movement of a man who was the operational center of a large and complex criminal enterprise, was now compressed into monitored visiting rooms and communications that had to be indirect enough to survive scrutiny. He wrote to the second Anna, "The letters that survive in the historical record are not intimate documents. They are the letters of a man managing his situation, practical in their orientation, attentive to organizational concerns that could be discussed obliquely, formal in a way that reflected both the monitoring of the correspondence and the nature of the marriage itself, which had always been more formal than intimate. He asked about the house. He provided instructions, sometimes clear, sometimes necessarily oblique, about financial and organizational matters that required attention on the outside. He did not, in the surviving correspondence, write to her as a man writing to a woman he missed. She replied. Her letters have not been preserved in the same way. The historical record has focused on Vito's correspondence, not hers, which is its own form of information about whose voice has been deemed worth keeping. What she wrote, how she described the household situation, whether she expressed anything of the weight she was carrying, these are questions the archive does not answer. The organizational world outside the prison was changing in ways that would eventually make Vito's maintained authority increasingly theoretical. The men who had managed operations in his absence were managing them with the practical autonomy that comes from being present and operational, while the nominal authority is behind bars. Decisions were being made that Vito would not have made, or would not have made, in the same way. The structure he had spent decades building was not collapsing. It was evolving, as organizational structures do when their center of gravity shifts, and the evolution was not entirely under his direction. For the second Anna, this organizational evolution had direct, practical consequences that arrived without announcement. The financial flows that sustained the household were managed by people whose primary obligations were to the organization and to their own survival within it, not to the domestic arrangements of an imprisoned man's wife. When those flows became irregular, as they did increasingly through the early 1960s, she had no recourse. She was not part of the organizational structure. She had no standing within it to make demands. She had the legal status of a wife and the practical status of a dependent, and the organization's obligation to dependents had always been informal and conditional, rather than structural and guaranteed. She began, during these years, to reduce the household scale. Staff were let go. The maintenance of the Atlantic Highlands property, which had required continuous investment to sustain the standard that Vito's position had demanded, became a negotiation between what the house needed and what the available finances would support. The visible prosperity that had been one of the defining features of the household through the 1950s contracted quietly, without public announcement, in the way that reduced circumstances always contract. Gradually, then more noticeably, always managed with as much dignity as the situation allowed. The visits to Milan were a requirement she appears to have met consistently. She made the trip to Michigan with the specific indignity of the federal prison visiting process. The security procedures, the monitored rooms, the carefully observed interactions that were simultaneously personal and entirely surveilled. She brought news of the household, of the children, of the organizational matters she had been asked to attend to. Vito received the visits with the focused attention of a man who was processing multiple simultaneous concerns, and for whom his wife's presence represented one of several inputs rather than the primary purpose of the occasion. Whether she found these visits sustaining in any personal sense is something the record does not address. She made them. She continued to make them through the early 1960s as Vito's health began to decline in the way that health declines in men past 60 who are managing the physical and psychological compression of federal imprisonment. He had entered prison as a powerful man who expected his power to persist through the confinement. He was aging inside the confinement, and the persistence of his power was becoming increasingly dependent on reputation rather than active capacity. In 1962, Vito was transferred to the federal prison at Springfield, Missouri for medical treatment. His health had deteriorated to the point that the standard federal facility could no longer manage his needs. The transfer meant a longer journey for visits, a different institutional environment, a medical context that added another layer to the already complicated relationship between the second Anna and the man she was still legally married to and practically responsible for maintaining a connection with. She continued the visits. The household in Atlantic Highlands continued, diminished but persistent. The children had largely established their own lives by this point, and the house had shed most of its operational staff, most of its organizational character, and most of the social significance it had carried through the years of Vito's power. It was a large, increasingly expensive-to-maintain property, occupied by a woman whose husband was in federal prison and whose connection to the world that had once given the property its meaning had been progressively severed. The organizational world had moved on. New arrangements had solidified in Vito's absence. The men who managed the operations that had once centered on the Atlantic Highlands household now managed them from other locations, in response to other authorities, with a relationship to Vito that was increasingly nominal. He was still the named boss of the organization that bore his name. He was also a man in his mid-60s in a federal medical facility in Missouri, managing a declining body and a diminishing capacity to direct an organization that had learned, in his absence, to function without him. The second Anna managed what remained. She paid the bills that could be paid. She maintained the connections that could still be maintained. She made the trips to Missouri, and she moved through a world that had shed its relationship to the name she carried with remarkable speed. The same world that had once organized itself around that name, that had treated her presence as socially significant, that had required her domestic management and rewarded it with the specific form of protection that proximity to power provides. That protection was gone. What remained was the obligation to the house, to the children, to the visits, to the maintenance of a connection with a man in federal prison whose organizational authority was diminishing by the year, and whose personal relationship with her had always been formal enough that the distance of imprisonment had not fundamentally altered its emotional character. She continued because continuing was what the role required, and she had been performing the role for long enough that the requirements of it and the habits of her daily life had become, for practical purposes, the same thing. Sometime in the early 1960s, without announcement or acknowledgement, both Annas began to disappear from the historical record. This did not happen because their lives had ended. The first Anna would die in 1963, the second would outlive Vito by years. But because the organizational world that had generated the documentation of their lives had moved past them, and the historians and journalists who would eventually reconstruct that world had already decided, at a structural level, which lives were worth following. The decision was not made consciously. It was made through the accumulation of smaller decisions. Which interviews to pursue, which archives to prioritize, which figures in the Genovese story had enough organizational significance to warrant sustained attention. Vito had organizational significance. His associates had organizational significance. The women who had maintained his households, managed his domestic image, and absorbed the consequences of his decisions had served their narrative function as background, as context, as occasional dramatic episodes in a story organized around his movements. And the record moved past them the way a current moves past a fixed point. The first Anna's final years took place in circumstances that the historical record barely touches. After the divorce, after the legal battle over support payments, after the withdrawal of the social world that had surrounded her for 20 years, she lived in a reduced version of the life the marriage had provided. Financially constrained, socially diminished, without the community that had once been the texture of her daily existence. She was in her 50s and early 60s during these years, not old by any reasonable measure, but old enough that rebuilding from the particular kind of loss she had experienced, not widowhood, not poverty in the absolute sense, but the removal of every social and financial structure that had defined her adult life, was a project without obvious resources. She had no public presence during these years. She gave no interviews. She did not write about her experience. The woman who had stood in a New Jersey courtroom in 1946 and said, out loud, what no one was supposed to say, had nothing further to say to the outside world, or the outside world had made clear that it had no further interest in what she might say. The testimony she had given, which had contributed in ways she may not have fully calculated to the body of public knowledge about Vito's operations, had not translated into any form of protection or recognition. It had simply existed in a court record, used by people with interests of their own, and then moved past. She died in 1963, in circumstances that the surviving record does not describe with any precision. The accounts that mention her death treat it as a biographical footnote in Vito's story. Yea, she was his first wife. She had contested the divorce. She had made disclosures in court. She had died. The specific texture of her final years, what she thought about the life she had lived, and the choices it had not given her, whether she had arrived at any settled relationship with what had happened to her. None of this is available. What is available is the contrast between how much documentation exists of Vito's life during the same period. The prison records, the organizational analyses, the FBI surveillance reports, the journalistic accounts, and how little exists of hers. He was in federal prison during the years of her death, reduced in power and aging, but he remained a subject of continuous institutional attention. She was in New Jersey, having lived a life whose proximity to that power had shaped every significant thing that happened to her, and she was entirely invisible. The second Anna's erasure was slower and had a different character. She outlived Vito, which meant she had to manage the specific aftermath of being a widow whose husband had been convicted of federal crimes and whose estate was entangled in a decade of legal proceedings. She was not simply forgotten. She was actively residualized, made into a remainder, the living administrative consequence of a man whose story had been told and whose organizational legacy was being managed by people who had no particular interest in her continued comfort or visibility. The Atlantic Highlands property had been the anchor of her adult life since the early 1950s. Its maintenance through the years of Vito's imprisonment had required a continuous and increasingly difficult negotiation between the demands of the property and the finances available to sustain it. By the mid-1960s, as Vito's imprisonment extended and his organizational authority became more nominal, the financial flows that had supported the household had diminished to the point where sustaining the property at its original scale was no longer possible. She made adjustments. This is the language of the historical record for what were in practice a series of losses. Staff, upkeep, the visible markers of the prosperity that had characterized the household during the years of Vito's power. Each adjustment was individually manageable in the way that losses are manageable when they arrive one at a time. The accumulation of them altered the character of the household, from the domestic anchor of a powerful man's organized life into something more closely resembling what it had always actually been. A large, expensive house in New Jersey, maintained by a woman who had organized her entire adult life around a man now serving a federal sentence. The organizational world had not simply moved on from the second Anna. It had reorganized in ways that made the Genovese name, as an active organizational designation, both more prominent and more disconnected from the actual Genovese still alive in Atlantic Highlands. The family name attached to the organization persisted as an institutional label, applied to a structure that Vito now influenced only distantly. The woman who legally bore that name had no standing within the structure, no claim on its resources, no relationship to the men who ran it that would have supported any expectation of support or recognition. She visited Vito in Springfield through the mid-1960s. The visits had become, by this point, almost purely formal. The maintenance of a connection whose content had always been more organizational than personal, and which now had almost no organizational content either, as Vito's capacity to direct affairs from a federal medical facility declined with his health. She made the trip because the role required it, because stopping would have required an explanation she had no interest in providing, because the habit of performing the marriage's obligations had been laid down across enough years that it continued to operate even after the structure that had generated those obligations had largely dissolved. Vito died on February 14, 1969, in the Federal Medical Center at Springfield. He was 71 years old. The cause of death was heart disease. which had been managing his final years in the way that heart disease manages the final years of men who have lived as he had lived, with accumulating limitation, with periods of relative stability interrupted by progressive deterioration, with the institutional competence of federal medical care sustaining a life that his body was working to conclude. The second Anna was notified. She made the arrangements that a wife makes when a husband dies, the practical administrative work of death that falls to the person closest to the deceased, regardless of the emotional content of the relationship. She arranged for his burial. She managed the immediate practical consequences of his death with the same competent, contained presence she had brought to every other practical demand the marriage had placed on her. The obituaries that followed Vito's death treated him as the significant figure the organizational record made him. They traced his career, his rise through the underworld, his relationship with Luciano, the Appalachian disaster, the narcotics conviction. They mentioned the second Anna briefly, as wives are mentioned in obituaries, by name in the context of survivors. They mentioned the first Anna not at all, or in a single clause noting the earlier marriage's dissolution. The estate proceedings that followed the death were protracted and difficult. Vito's assets, the real estate, the financial holdings, whatever remained of the organizational wealth he had accumulated across 4 decades, were subject to competing claims from federal investigators. From the organizational structure that had its own interests in how the assets were distributed, and from the legal heirs of a man whose financial life had been deliberately structured to resist exactly the kind of orderly asset transfer that a legitimate estate proceeding required. The second Anna's position in these proceedings was formally that of the surviving spouse, which carried legal weight but not necessarily practical power. The assets that should, by the logic of estate law, have passed to her were entangled in a web of organizational claims, federal interest, and deliberate opacity that made their actual value and accessibility deeply uncertain. She had lawyers. She pursued what she was entitled to. The process was expensive, slow, and produced outcomes that the historical record does not fully document. What the record does preserve, in fragments, is the shape of her life in the years after Vito's death. Reduced, quieter, increasingly disconnected from the world that had defined her adult existence. The Atlantic Highlands house passed through various arrangements. The social world that had once surrounded it had long since dispersed. The children had their own lives. She was a widow in her 60s, in a house too large for her circumstances, carrying a name that the outside world associated primarily with a dead man's crimes. The Italian-American community that had been her social world had its own complex relationship to the Genovese legacy. A mixture of residual loyalty to the organizational structures that had provided certain kinds of community support, genuine shame about the public exposure that the Senate investigations and the criminal trials had brought, and a general movement away from the visible associations with organized crime that had characterized an earlier generation. For the second Anna, this meant that the community she had belonged to had shifted around her in ways that made her position within it less clear than it had been. She did not write about any of this. She did not give interviews in the years after Vito's death. She did not seek to correct the historical record, to assert her own account of the marriage, to provide any counterweight to the organizational history that had absorbed and then discarded her. Whether this silence was chosen, maintained out of habit, or simply the result of a world that had stopped asking, is impossible to determine from the outside. She lived into the 1970s. The specific year of her death and the circumstances of it are not prominently recorded in the sources that document the Genovese story. She appears in the final pages of the accounts that mention her at all as a woman who was present at the beginning, who managed the middle years, and who is last noted alive without any record of what those final years contained. The organizational name she had carried for nearly 2 decades, the name that had been a source of social protection, financial security, and institutional identity, survived her in the form of the organization that still bore it, still operating, still referred to by the name of a man who had been dead for years by the time she herself died. The name persisted. She did not. Vito Genovese had spent the better part of 4 decades building something he understood as permanent. The organization that bore his name, that still bears his name, in the institutional language of law enforcement and organized crime history, was designed to outlast any individual, including him. The structures he had put in place, the hierarchies he had established, the relationships and the violence and the accumulated authority he had exercised across a career that spanned Prohibition, the Second World War, the post-war reorganization of American organized crime, and the federal prosecutions of the late 1950s. All of it was intended to persist in a form that would continue to generate the power and money that power required to sustain itself. It did persist. The organization continued after his imprisonment. It continued after his death. It continues in attenuated form in the present day, referred to by the name he gave it, managed by men several generations removed from the structures he built, operating in a landscape that he would not entirely recognize. The name endured. The institutional memory of what he had built endured. The historical record of his career, the FBI files, the Senate testimony, the journalistic accounts, the books written about the American underworld that treat him as one of its defining figures, endured. What did not endure in any comparable form was any account of what the construction and maintenance of that permanence had cost the two women who had been closest to it. The first Anna's contribution to the historical record consists primarily of what she said in a New Jersey courtroom in 1946. The disclosures she made in those proceedings were specific enough and damaging enough that they appear in histories of organized crime as a source, cited for the information they contain about Vito's operations, about the financial structures of his household, about the nature of his criminal activities. She is cited as a source. She is not examined as a person. The woman who produced the information that appears in the footnotes of organized crime histories has no history of her own in those same texts. She is instrumentalized by the record the same way she was instrumentalized by the marriage, useful for what she could provide, invisible as a subject. The specific facts of how she lived her final years, the reduced circumstances, the ongoing legal battle over support payments that Vito's organization had the structural capacity to frustrate indefinitely, the social isolation that followed her departure from the world she had inhabited for 20 years. These are not part of the organized crime history that documents the period she lived through. They are recoverable in fragments from court records and newspaper archives that no one has assembled into a sustained account. They have simply not been assembled because the assembly of them was never deemed worth the effort. The second Anna's absence from the historical record has a slightly different texture. She is present in accounts of Vito's life as a named figure, his second wife, the woman he married in 1952, the surviving spouse who managed the household through his imprisonment, and the estate proceedings after his death. She appears where the organizational history requires her to appear, and nowhere else. Her interiority, what she thought about the marriage, about the first Anna, about the organizational world she had lived inside, about the specific losses that had accumulated across nearly 2 decades of managing a household built on a foundation she was never permitted to fully see, is entirely absent from every account that mentions her name. This is not a coincidence of archival survival. It is a structural feature of how organized crime history has been written, which is to say, how the men who ran the organizations have been treated as the primary subjects and the women who sustained those organizations. Domestic and social infrastructure have been treated as background. The background does not require interiority. The background does not require its own chapter. The background is present when the foreground needs it, and invisible when it does not. The Atlantic Highlands house sat at the center of both these women's lives for decades. It was the property Anna maintained while Vito was in Italy. It was the property the second Anna moved into in 1952 and managed through his imprisonment. It was large, visible, expensive, a physical marker of the prosperity that Vito's organizational power had generated. After his death, the property passed through the estate proceedings and eventually out of the family's control, absorbed into the ordinary commerce of New Jersey real estate, changed and renovated and resold in the way that properties are when the human histories attached to them have been forgotten or never recorded. It stands now, or stood, until its most recent iteration, without any marker of what happened inside it. No historical record attached to the address, no acknowledgement of the decades of domestic labor, managed silence, cultivated invisibility, and accumulated loss that the two women who lived there had provided as the price of their proximity to the man whose name the property carried. The house is simply a house. What it cost to maintain it, in human terms, is not attached to its address. The legal name, Genovese, continued to appear in law enforcement records through the decades after Vito's death. The organization named for him remained one of the 5 families of the New York underworld, subject to continuing federal prosecution, reorganized multiple times, diminished and restabilized and diminished again through the RICO prosecutions of the 1980s and the decades that followed. The name in those records refers to an institutional structure. It does not refer to the women who bore it legally, who carried it through their daily lives, who were shaped and constrained and ultimately discarded by the world it represented. There is something specific about the way that powerful men's names persist in institutional form, while the people most directly affected by those men are absorbed into silence. The Genovese organization is a documented structure. The first Anna is a source in a footnote. The second Anna is a name in a list of survivors. The disproportion between these forms of persistence is not incidental. It reflects a consistent set of choices about whose experience is worth preserving and whose is adequately accounted for by their proximity to a man whose experience has already been preserved. Both women made choices within the narrow range of choices their world provided. The first Anna chose, eventually, to speak, and paid for it with the systematic removal of every protection the marriage had provided. The second Anna chose, consistently, not to speak, and was rewarded with a silence so complete that her actual experience of nearly 2 decades inside one of the most documented households in American organized crime history is almost entirely inaccessible. The choice to speak and the choice not to speak produced, in the end, the same result: erasure. The mechanism differed. The outcome did not. Vito Genovese is remembered as a significant figure in the history of American organized crime. The books written about him are detailed and numerous. The FBI files generated by the surveillance of his activities run to thousands of pages. The Senate testimony that examined his operations constitutes a substantial public record. The organization that bears his name has its own historiography, its own documented evolution, its own place in the literature of American criminal history. The first Anna Genovese lived for 63 years. She was a child of immigrant New York, a woman who married twice, who managed a household inside one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country for over 20 years, who found in herself the capacity to walk into a courtroom and say what she was not supposed to say, and who spent the remaining years of her life managing the consequences of having said it. This is the outline of a life, the interior of it, what she wanted, what she feared, what she understood about the world she had moved through, and what she failed to understand is not available. The second Anna Genovese lived into the 1970s. She was a widow with children who made a practical choice in the mid-1940s to marry a man whose world she understood well enough to enter with open eyes, and who found that understanding the world in outline did not prepare her for the specific cost of living inside it. She managed a household for nearly 2 decades, maintained a marriage that was formal rather than intimate, made the visits to Michigan and Missouri, arranged the funeral, navigated the estate. She was competent and discreet and entirely without a recorded interior life. She is survived in the historical record by the name she carried and nothing else. The name persists. It is attached to an organization, to a history, to a set of federal prosecutions and Senate investigations and organized crime biographies. It is attached to a man who built something he intended to be permanent and whose permanence has, in institutional form, outlasted him by more than half a century. It is not attached in any sustained way to the 2 women who bore it. They have been left in the specific silence that the world reserves for people whose primary documented significance was their proximity to someone else. Present in the margins of a history organized around another person, visible only when that history required them to be, and invisible everywhere else. There is a particular kind of historical forgetting that does not require anyone to make a decision. It happens through accumulation, through the slow addition of choices about what is worth preserving, what is worth following, whose account of events constitutes the record, and whose constitutes the background to someone else's record. By the time the forgetting is complete, there is no single act responsible for it. There is simply an absence where a life should be, and the absence has been there long enough that it no longer registers as a loss. Both Annas have been forgotten in this way, not erased through any single deliberate act, but gradually residualized, made into the edges of a story organized around a man whose organizational significance was never in question and whose personal cost to the people closest to him was never, by the standards of the history that documented him, a subject worth sustained attention. The first Anna walked into a courtroom in 1946 and did something that her world had no framework for and no forgiveness of. She told the truth about a man who had built his entire career on the management of what could and could not be said publicly. The truth, she told, was used by lawyers, by journalists, by federal investigators building cases that would eventually produce convictions. It was used by everyone except the person who produced it. She received, in exchange for producing it, a divorce settlement that was contested for years, a social world that closed against her, and a historical record that cited her testimony without examining her life. The second, Anna made a different choice. She maintained her silence from the beginning to the end, performed the marriage's requirements with a competence that the world around her demanded, and then immediately forgot to credit, and left no account of what the performance had cost. Her silence was rewarded with the same erasure as the first Anna's speech. The historical record did not distinguish between the woman who spoke and the woman who did not. It simply moved past both of them toward the organizational history it had always been more interested in. What remains across both lives is a set of unanswered questions that the surviving record cannot resolve. Whether the first Anna knew, precisely and fully, what had happened to Gerard Vernetico, and what she made of that knowledge across the years of the marriage that followed. Whether the second Anna's practical eyes-open entry into the marriage included any genuine assessment of the first Anna's experience, and what it meant that she entered anyway. Whether either woman, in the private interior of a life the record does not reach, arrived at anything resembling a settled account of what the years inside that household had been. These questions are not answerable. They are the questions that remain when the record has been exhausted. Not mysteries in the dramatic sense, but ordinary human interiorities that were never documented, because no one asked, and no one asked because the answers were not considered relevant to the story being told. Vito Genovese died in a federal medical facility in Missouri in February 1969. The organization that bears his name continued. The history that documents his career continued to be written. The two women who had maintained the domestic infrastructure of that career, who had managed its households, absorbed its consequences, carried its name through years of prosperity and years of wreckage, were left to the silence that had always been their designated place in it. They are there still, in the margins, in the footnotes, in the single lines of surviving documentation that give a name and a date and nothing further. Present enough to confirm that they existed, not present enough to tell you what that existence was.